and we're here to acknowledge Peter Farmer, and not so much his retirement, because the work that he's done while he's been working in his capacity at BVL. And he indicated about a year ago, I think, that I think the words were, "You've done your dash," I don't know if that's and having spent 2 terms as the chair of BVL, would not be putting himself forward for another term. So on the 18th of December, Council resolved that the Deputy Chair, Michael Smith, would take over. Peter's made a huge contribution since he was the first appointed to the newly formed Board of Bay Venues in 2013, and that followed the merger of Tauranga City Aquatics and City Venues into that one organisation. When his term does expire, which is the 30th of April, he'll have contributed 6 years continuous service. Probably one of the most important things that Council does when managing CCOs is appointing its directors, and it's the only way to ensure that the CCO cooperates and works effectively. So looking at the success of BVL, where it's come from and the progress that it's made and its many successes, it's pretty clear that the appointment of Peter has well and truly lived up to the Council's expectations, and I think it'd be fair enough to say it's actually exceeded them in terms of an effective CCO director and chair. And a recent independent review has highlighted that BVL has come out of its establishment phase in very good shape and with satisfaction of its key deliverables rated as high. So I do want to thank you on behalf of the City Council, Peter, for all your efforts and contributions that you've made. We do greatly appreciate that. I understand that Michael Smith's unable to be here today, but I want to congratulate him on his appointments at the same time as thanking you for your service. So thank you. There's a little something coming to your table. And it has a little ribbon on it, so we won't expect you to open it now. But if you'd like to say a few words, if you just press the button there to,
Thank you, Greg, for those kind words, and thank you all for this opportunity just to say how much I've enjoyed the privilege of leading your CCO as your chairman. It was a significant challenge. The taking 4 separate entities, which were at that stage losing about $2 million, in turning it into what it is today has been a great privilege. But it was a significant challenge, and a few lessons learned there. But certainly I look back and with some pleasure the relationship that I've had with all of the elected members, both current and past. That's been a real privilege and a pleasure. Obviously very proud of some of the significant achievements of Bay Venues. I mean, there's a lot of bricks and mortar and significant achievements there, including the Adams Centre and the 100 odd jobs that were generated there. But I think the thing I'm most proud about is the culture that Bay Venues has as an entity totally focused on customer satisfaction. As I said to them about the outset, we're going to have commercial disciplines to achieve good community outcomes, and that's exactly what we've done. If you have, in my opinion, commercial disciplines applied to any organisation, you will inevitably get good community outcomes and good community service or customer service. I was really pleased that Stuart Cosby, who I knew well personally, rang me up and said he went 12 months without a complaint, and apparently prior to that the complaints were thick and fast, so that was a good tick from Stuart. I've been involved with a lot of different activities in the city. It's that, I guess, is the reason why I thought, well, 6 years. One of the things that I really like doing is turnarounds, turnarounds and setting up organisations, and that's been a really cool thing to do with Bay Venues. So I want to sort of move on to the next challenge. I've been involved, as you're probably all aware, that in a philanthropic way with a lot of different entities in the city and community activities, and from flagpoles to Acorn to Compass Village or whatever. So that's what I want to see in the future. I'm happy to provide any service or advice or work that the council may want me to do at no charge. Don't worry about that. No charge. But where I can add value. If I can't add value, then there's no point. But thank you again for this opportunity. I just want to also thank Gary Dawson for his great support. He's been a superb chief executive. He leads a very good senior leadership team, and also to thank obviously the great, excellent, superb board of directors that I've worked with. Mike Smith, of course, is in the United States. He's president of Golf New Zealand, and he's been there cheering on Tiger Woods. So I won't say Mike's disappointed he's not here. He's pretty happy where he is. But thank you again. Thanks for this opportunity, and appreciate it.
Just to add to that, Max Mason, who's the CCO chair, to speak.
Yeah, just a couple of things that we've all enjoyed working with Peter very much, and I just wanted to sort of make the point, I guess, that as the inaugural chairman, it's not at all just like taking the chair of an organisation that's running well, and it's sort of business as usual. Inaugural chairman is really good because you're stamping your mark, and it really is I think a testament to your leadership that you've managed your board, you created a board, you've imposed your culture on that board and developed it, and that has flowed through to the organisation. So I think it's a real testament of leadership as well. The fact that you're always driving for better performance is fantastic, and I think that we've all learned a lot from that. It's all about performance and customer service, as you've mentioned. I think Peter's one of the things, if you're going to drive performance, is you're always happy to confront non-performance. And Peter's famous for his elephants in the room statements. I think the one GTG said we have got 8 elephants in the room. We need to discuss them, and there were 12 actually. He wasn't not scared to jump on top of that elephant and stab it to death and deal with it face to face, but in a respectful manner. So I think that's it's all about performance and how we go forward together. But I think looking to the future, Peter's got the exhibition centre particularly to look forward to, and the Memorial Park facility potentially. But also I think the thing that I'm particularly excited about is Peter's establishment of a working group to establish new funding mechanisms for the city and our facilities. That is really, really exciting. And I think all of the people, and by the way, we've just signed off the 3 new directors for the board, so that's great.
Excellent.
Yeah, and particularly Colin Groves, I think he's got a fantastic potential for really bringing in some good innovative funding for us in conjunction with the board. So it's been a real pleasure working with you and your board, Peter, and I hope you're not going too far.
No. Well, thank you, Max. It's very kind words, and there's some pretty exciting projects that we've got in front of it. You've obviously the exhibition centre and the Memorial Park development, and I mean standing still in this very dynamic environment just ain't an option, and we've just got to find funding mechanisms outside the council's resources, but everybody, particularly the elected members, have got to be prepared to look at it laterally and just see how we can leverage some funding out of what we have, because we've got a lot of assets here which we can do that with. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
And now we are adjourning the meeting till 1 o'clock. So thank you very much. The meeting's adjourned till 1 p.m. Okay, we'll resume the meeting, folks. Just to let you know what's happening in the order of things. First of all, we're going to hear from Mr. Paul Hobbs from MB. Then we'll do DC 82, which is the City Council's response to the MB report. And then DC 77, which is a Bella Vista general update. And then DC 88. Okay, so that's just so everybody knows what's happening. Paul, welcome. We'd just like to press the button on the microphone and, yeah, the floor is yours.
Yeah, well, thanks to the council, the elected members and members of the public here today for hosting MB to present this report. I've got a PowerPoint presentation I'll just go through, and it sort of speaks to the report, but it's sort of a high-level overview of the process that we went through and our findings and what happens following those findings and things like that. So I'll just race ahead with the presentation. So as I mentioned, first we'll talk about our sort of mandate as a chief executive function under the Building Act, that we can have a look at councils and how they're performing their functions, whether that be a building consent authority or a territorial authority. And then just a quick sort of overview of the process that we followed as part of this review. Talk about the Bella Vista site a little bit, not in a great level of detail, and then just mention that we looked, sort of did an environmental scan of other developments and buildings erected in and around the same time as Bella Vista, but also looked at some recent work that was being carried out by the council. Then I suppose the most important part is the findings of the review, and what comes out the other end is some actions that are on the council, and then there's a sort of a monitoring framework for that extends out 12 months from when we handed the report over to the council. And then we think it's important as part of our compliance strategy for councils and for the whole sort of industry is actually what can be learned from these types of things when they occur. So we've got a sort of comms strategy around how we sort of get that out to the wider sector. So MB's powers, as I've mentioned, we have some powers under the Building Act to look at councils. There is a accreditation scheme that runs under the Building Act that MB owns, but IAN's accreditation body actually there's a two-year annual cycle that IANS looks and examines the council's functions in terms of their building control functions. But where things happen that are a little bit unusual, or in this case, a large sort of failed development that has some media interest, and actually the Minister for Building and Construction was very interested in the failure too, and other stakeholders and many members of the public. So we waited for the Heath report to be completed, so we wanted to see what happened with Paul Heath's report to the council, and after that we chose to come in and exercise some powers under the Building Act. Section 204 and 276 of the Building Act provides the ability for MB to come in and undertake monitoring and various other functions under those sections. So as you can see there, we initiated that in August 2018, and we were basically very interested in understanding how the council performed its functions in relation to the Bella Vista development, and in a wider context how they were performing their functions on other sites around Tauranga. And this was answering one of the recommendations in the Heath report. So that was Paul Heath didn't actually go into the reasons why the development failed, so we were asked, and we could do that insofar as we could look at the council, their contribution to that, because that's what we're mandated to do. And then we were very interested in considering measures that would prevent similar failures occurring, not just in Tauranga but elsewhere in the country also. So just this is a very high-level overview of the process followed. So as it says there, in August we put the council on notice through a letter to the Chief Executive that a review would be undertaken. And then we sought to, and we'd already started doing this, gathering information and undertaking what we call an environmental scan. We visited sites and we interviewed many people from in and around Tauranga, so that would be in excess of a couple of dozen interviews, formal interviews that we carried out in a generic form. So we were asking consistently the same questions and looking for the right answers to those questions. Then we drafted a report, and I guess the outcomes of that report point to some monitoring and some actions on the council to improve their processes. So the Bella Vista development itself, I would say, having been deeply involved in this, I sort of led the review. It's a complex site, and I would say that it's a little bit different than the land that Tauranga would normally work on historically. If you look to Papamoa, we say that in the report, and other parts of Tauranga, there's a lot of flat land being developed and where the ground conditions aren't what we would deem to be under the sort of building standard to be good ground, but this one had a lot more sort of challenges geotechnically and geographically. It was very steep site, and as you can see there, I've sort of on that second bullet point, I've sort of pointed to the fact that not only have you got a steep sloping site, but then you're trying to bench in more dwellings by subdividing the site, which presents further issues around locating those buildings, providing a building platform, and then accessing them through being able to drive onto site, which were all problems. And as you can see, just topographically there, the buildings are very tightly bunched, and when you're dealing with surface water on site and things like that and services, it becomes very difficult to comply, and that whole process around compliance has to be managed very tightly. So we observed the construction sequencing on the site wasn't what we'd normally see throughout the country. We get involved with the 67 councils around the country, and so we're pretty aware of what goes on. And on steep sites, there's a lot of steep sites around Wellington and other parts of the country, and your construction sequencing and how you actually deliver the housing on site is very important. So we observed that there was mass development of the site, so that was where there was mass excavation, and all the sites were basically developed as in one instance, which created issues, and some of the levels and some of the plans that were associated with the sites weren't accurate, and so that's sort of all spoken to in our report as far as that we observed that some of the consent shouldn't have been received and weren't fit to be processed in the state they were in. And then this is just a minor point really, this was just some things that popped up again and again. We were told that there was sort of people were coming and going from the site, and particularly around sort of supervision of the site wasn't observed as what people would think would be an adequate level of supervision for quite a big development. This is in the report that we published because we thought that the report would have a wide audience, wider than our normal sort of technical reviews. So we tried to provide an image, a representation that would paint the picture of some of the issues on site, and primarily the biggest issue was that those large cuts that aren't retained. Those are it's pretty much unprecedented to see large cuts like that not dealt with before buildings go on site in some way, shape or form. So that was quite an issue, obviously, and that's what led to the site ultimately being shut down by one of the regulators, WorkSafe. So that sort of speaks for itself. Those are some of the issues that have been reported about the buildings on site. And there's just an image. I thought that was one of the images that we collected from the various images that we got. This was before we arrived on the scene, so it predates us being involved. But that you can see, you shouldn't be having large body of water like that. Sorry. You shouldn't be having a large body of water like that. It's actually a construction hazard, and it's catered for in the Building Act, and that was one of the enforcement things that we've said the council need to do better at. You shouldn't have construction demolition hazard. There's F5, clause F5 of the code speaks to that. And also those cuts, you can see they're basically gravity's working on them alongside some other, rain, inundation and whatever you have there that will affect the stability of those slopes, and it's quite sandy soil, so it's once it gets heavy it all just tends to fall off. So the findings of the review, this is probably the key finding. We found that the council didn't, the normal processes that they're accredited to, they didn't follow to the letter of the law, and in fact sometimes they departed quite a bit from what was normal process, and that largely centred around the appointment of a couple of people really in the processing area and in the inspection space that would be treated as a single point of contact, which sort of you lost the ability in some ways to escalate concerns further up the food chain within the council, and also you lost that the ability to have other inspectors looking at work and a second pair of eyes, like a peer review, if you like. So that was reported, I think, of all the interviews, that was a consistent theme we just about heard from everyone. I would say, I think it's a 95 percentile people said that was the case. Poor record keeping, there was a bit of a caveat to that. So at the time that this development was underway, there was a change in the IT system, sort of platform that supports the inspection and record keeping. They moved from one provider to another, and I know there was we can see there were some issues in that transition, but still some of the record keeping was poor, and we couldn't trace some of the failed inspections as adequately as we would have liked, or as appropriately if you look through the eyes of the accreditation body. So we observe accreditation assessments across the country, so it's fair to say that the decision making in Bella Vista was not recorded very well at all. So the other thing there was the council have inspection staff in-house. That inspection team that they have doesn't hold all the competency to inspect across all code clauses. So from time to time, professionals from the industry will be called upon. These are chartered professional engineers and others that can verify compliance. So they may have made some assumptions in their design when that work is underway and the building work's being performed by the building practitioners. The engineers and others will come in and verify compliance. So that could be around the bearing capacity of the soil, could be around placement of foundations and cover of reinforcing steel in the foundations, things like that. So the council are looking to experts to provide verification of compliance, and there was some big gaps around that, and actually that speaks to the sort of construction sequencing too, that we thought that some of the inspections should have been halted where there wasn't verification being provided at critical times in the construction process. So that's one of our recommendations there, to tidy that area up. Another area that was concerning was departures from the consented drawings. And as I mentioned before, some of the consented drawings we didn't think were adequate to provide I suppose the reasonable grounds that the council required in order to grant a consent. I think that departure was seen, well, I know the departure was seen most commonly in minor variations. There were some amendments to consents. So a minor variation is where you change the means of compliance in a minor way. But we observed that, and there's an example in the report of the underpinning of a foundation, and we can only think that the underpinning would have been put there to pick up on some soft ground or a bit of a design flaw where the foundation couldn't satisfactorily bridge some bit of soft ground or something. But in our mind and in our guidance that we've published around minor variations, that should have been sent back to someone in-house that could have processed that and dealt with that as a formal amendment to consent, so it could have been considered as part of that process, which is a more detailed sort of evaluation of its compliance, where it was just dealt with and made some inspection notes that this was designed by a chartered professional engineer and we believe it complies, but that's as far as it went. And then the enforcement, I guess, is another area. So we see this across various councils that we visit. Some have very passive enforcement policy, others have active policies, and some others fall somewhere in between. Some of the stuff that we'd seen on this site, we thought there were various powers available to the council, notices to fix, infringement notices, complaints about practitioners that haven't met their obligations as a licensed person or a registered practitioner. And so we thought there was many and varied opportunities to actually take some action, and though we don't administer the Resource Management Act, it's probably the same there, that there was opportunities under the Resource Management Act, but we saw many opportunities under the Building Act where there was clearly a contravention of the Building Act, and it could have been dealt with earlier in the piece. So this is, so those are the main sort of findings. There are others in the report, but those are the sort of top half dozen. So as a result of those findings, we've got 10 recommendations in the report. These are quite detailed, and they speak to some of the policies and procedures of the councils that we thought that could improve. And so the council has two months to report back on the progress. They've already provided a report back in some areas, well, all areas, I must say, but some are more detailed than others, which is good. It's progress. We can see progress is being made. And so when we receive that, we'll look at those, and then in 6 months' time, in around September this year, we'll revisit the council and we'll look at those processes, and we'll be seeking to see them enacted. And at that time, we'll do a similar visit to what we did last year when we came up on a number of occasions and went around sites and talked to people, talked to staff, and just to have confidence that those things have changed. And then there's a further detailed update that's required in 12 months. So we've just left that open. That could be a revisit, depending on how that 6 month goes. And but it's we'll be coming back to the council in some way, shape, or form and looking for a report back on those findings. And there could well be other things that pop out of our September assessment. So. And it just so happens that IANZ, who the accreditation body, their assessment falls in around that same time too. So we'll likely undertake those two as a combined assessment with IANZ. So yeah, that's the sort of actions, if you like, that are jointly on the ministry and on the council in terms of answering those actions and us following that monitoring regime. So these are the broader sort of learnings for the sector and other territorial authorities and building consent authorities that are around the country. So we've said to people, and this is one of the key things, providing your policies and procedures are fit for purpose, you should always follow those. If you depart from them, you need to really clearly document where you've departed from them. And so that's a very important, in any sort of accreditation scheme, that's a sort of underpins any sort of accreditation model. This is another thing that's really important. Ensure that the correct safeguards are in place to support changes in work practices. So as I mentioned before, if the land that you're building on is, you can still get a code compliant building on it, but it's more marginal land. Council needs to recognise that, and they need to train the staff appropriately, and they need to have the right safeguards in place to manage that risk. So it's just about adopting a risk-based approach to your, whether that be processing, inspecting or whatever. That goes for all councils across the country. And train and upskill staff. So this is about, and I think the next one deals with this too, that currency of technical knowledge is very important. So we, you know, there seems to be a significant number of technical defects on this particular development. Those things should be picked up, and you shouldn't be, if you've got a non-compliant block wall, for example, you shouldn't be putting framing above that, and you shouldn't be putting a roof on that building. The work should be halted, and you should seek to resolve those issues before you go any further. One of the other things that we would always say is actually people have obligations under the Building Act, whether that be the ministry, the council, practitioners too, if they're licensed. Where practitioners haven't met their licensing obligations, they should be. You should complain to whether that's a statutory board or some other organisation that administers the complaints function for that occupational licensing group. One of the other things, this doesn't matter if you're in central government or local government, you should exercise your statutory powers without fear of favour. So that's what we're keen to say to other councils, building consent authorities and TAs. If you're tasked and you have a delegated authority, you should exercise those powers consistently with the Building Act or with any other legislation that you're operating under. So that was really all I had. It's sort of a high level overview, but I'd sort of invite you to, if you haven't already, to read that report. And yeah, I think it's sort of important sort of milestone for the council that they sort of learn from here, and you know, everything that we've heard so far is positive in that respect, but we'll just we'll keep that conversation going for the next wee while to have confidence ourselves. So I'm happy to take a few questions if you have any.
If, I'll just kick off then, because the council's probably have one or two questions. You just mentioned the council needs to exercise its powers without fear or favour.
Yep.
And then one of your conclusions, you didn't really touch on it today so much, but you did the first bit, stated that management intervened and subverted normal council processes. This was in part due to undue or inappropriate pressure from the developer. Mm-hmm. Can you expand on that, especially in the relation to council normally exercising its powers, and why this might have been, why they didn't?
I guess that it stems from all the interviews we undertook. We heard a consistent message from staff, both current that are still working for the council and past, that normal processes weren't followed, and staff felt that they couldn't escalate concerns internally. So that, and I think that stems, well, we know from the various interviews and other documentary evidence that we saw on file, that there was some direction given to staff that would say that the processes were different on this particular job than they were on others. So that sort of speaks to that conclusion, I guess. Yeah.
Speaks to that part of it, but what about the down the bit about due to undue or inappropriate pressure from the developer. I mean, there has to be a reason, and that's what I'm trying to get to the bottom
Yeah,
of.
okay.
Yeah.
So, yeah, this was, again, second-hand accounts, I suppose, from all the interviews that we undertook, and that staff felt unsafe at times on site, and also that pressure was applied to them in their jobs. And I think that was the council's response to have two individuals, one in the processing area and one in the inspection area that was a sole point of contact. So I think it's really around the nature of how things played out on site and how they interacted with the developer on site, and in communications and everything else around the building consent process. Yeah.
Thanks, Paul, for that. What assurance do we have that this wasn't a wider, more systemic
Yeah.
issues? What makes you think it is just sort of ring-fenced this particular development?
So, yeah, I probably didn't delve enough into that because I said I would talk about other sites, but I just sort of mentioned we did a bit of an environmental scan. So what we did was, during the period of Bella Vista, there was approximately, if we think of those years that it was sort of operative building consent, there was about 8,000 consents issued by the council. So we looked across a range of consents and developments. So we visited sites, we pulled some files, and we also used some intelligence. So we have ministerial correspondence and other things that come through MB, and just various inboxes and things. So all of that gets collated, and it's basically intelligence for us. So we pulled all that together, which made us visit some sites that were of interest, and then there were other sites that we asked the council to provide us with that were on similar land. And so we visited those sites and we looked at the processes around those sites. So I guess if you look across 8,000 building consents and you've got one concentration of failure, that is 21 buildings on one site, and then we found a couple of instances of similar stuff, but it didn't have all the features of the failures, and they were sort of one-off houses. We couldn't find reason to believe there was a systemic failure. Just the volume wasn't such, and it seemed that it was just this one site that had it on that scale.
Thank you. We've undertaken site visits and we've had lots of photos and lots of reports. Can you speak to the site visits that you've done? How exploratory were you? How many houses did you visit? And is there a consistency across what you saw with those particular houses? Just talking the 21 in Bella Vista.
Yeah, so our process is more centred around the council's building control functions. So we didn't undertake a technical review of the buildings. There's a couple of determinations that are looking at, that's probably the appropriate way for MB to look at very technical issues with buildings, is to use the determinations process, where we'll get experts in and look at all the documentation, and we'll look at in depth and building code performance. So it's fair to say the team that we brought up here to look at the buildings are all technical people. Some are architects, ex-builders, engineers, what have you, and we've all worked in building control for many years. And just our general observation of the site was that you didn't have to look too far for non-compliance, and just things like, I come from a building background, and I've worked as a construction manager, so I would just my eyes drawn to things that you would, that maybe some people wouldn't see. And there was a lot of things that just aren't square, they're not level, they're out of plumb, and they're just you just look at driveways and they're not on the right sort of slope or gradient and things like that just jump out at you pretty quickly. So we weren't looking to question. There was many experts that crawled across the sites. We weren't looking to question the outcome of those reports. We're looking at 2 particular properties with determinations, but those are fairly narrow in their scope. So I suppose to answer your questions, we took those reports as read, and we were looking at the behaviour of the council as a building consent authority and a territorial authority, and what we saw in the evidence on file was that they hadn't done a good job in the areas that I sort of spoke to earlier.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just picking up on 3 points. One, you referenced the Heath report in your report and the statement by former Justice Heath that the council was appropriate to declare all the buildings either dangerous or affected. Now, understand there are a couple of determinations underway and there's that process. Are you in a position to agree or disagree with that statement which you've referenced in the report from Heath?
I can't agree with it or disagree because the determination's the appropriate pathway. So we would leave it to that, but that would only talk to those couple of properties that those determinations are for. But the council were well within their rights to exercise those powers if they thought they were, if that was the right thing to do at the time. You've got to make a judgment call. You're either going to be right or wrong. I guess we'll just see what those determinations throw up. We don't have an express view, but that'll be brought out for those 2 properties in the determination. Yeah.
Second question is around the pressure on the building staff from senior management at Tauranga City Council. It says that the risks appear to have been exacerbated by pressure from council staff felt from senior management, and we've talked about how we've said that Bella Vista may have been treated differently to other developments around the city. When you were referring to Bella Vista being treated differently on, because of an interaction between senior management and other council staff, would you say that that difference would be that the Bella Vista development was treated more favourably or less favourably as a result of pressure from senior management?
I guess it's not about being favourable or not. It's sort of about sticking to your process. And when you depart from that, you need to have a good reason to depart from it. So I wasn't there. I can't say if it was for what reason that was done, but it did occur. So and obviously we observed that some safeguards that were in place, and that's what the report talks about. Your escalation through the food chain, if you have a senior inspector, team leader that doesn't feel that he can get involved in some conversations about non-compliance and things like that, you lose. And as I mentioned, if you take a risk-based approach to these things, this is a complex site. You really want all your ducks in a row in terms of being a building consent authority and operating at the sort of top of your game, I suppose. So you don't want to be undermining those processes that have been accredited. And if you do step outside that, you need to have good reasons. So we never saw any documented good reason for actually stepping outside normal process.
That's the downward pressure from senior management. The upward pressure, it says there was also a result of direct contact from the developer, which staff said they found intimidating. And you mentioned that some staff didn't feel safe on site. I'm assuming you're not talking about the health and safety aspects of the site. It's about the interactions with the developer. What I guess subject to the requirements for confidentiality, but can you be more specific? I mean, you know, to feel threatened, to be threatened, there's got to be something happen or a chain of events occur to feel that way or to be led to believe that way. You know, I mean, you can't just say to somebody, you know, I was threatened when you weren't, or
Yeah.
yeah.
I guess it was a pretty consistent theme. I've talked about themes before. So when we talked to staff, they didn't feel their, you know, I suppose other sites you'd rock up and you could basically undertake your functions without feeling that you were being under duress to a certain degree. So we heard that people were filmed and things like this while they were undertaking their duties, and just general sort of not made to be felt comfortable on site, right? And this is not one individual. This is the collective on site that we're talking about. That's why we've used the term developer, but that could be whoever's there managing the site and others. So, yeah, that's probably as much as I can say, because this is about the council following their processes and procedures. It's not about any individual. So that's about as much as I can say on that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Paul. Just to go back to the question that Mayor Brownless asked, where you've said that management intervened and subverted normal council processes, this was in part due to undue or inappropriate influence. The BDO report, which was released in June 2017, was in response to pressure from the developer,
Yep.
complaining about, in fact, being, you know, that roadblocks were being put in the way and so on. And if I can just refer to that briefly, where they said we found no evidence to suggest deliberate obstruction. So, you know, we responded to that complaint really from the developer, where he continued. Did you consider the recommendations of the BDO report and whether they were followed or not in the subsequent months following that?
Oh, definitely. We looked at the BDO report and many other reports that have been commissioned.
Can you comment then on whether, you know, we didn't do enough from that BDO report, or, you know, what was your assessment of that?
Oh, I'm just trying to think of the timeline of events. So I think, I think there were changes, but I'm just thinking to the end of the Bella Vista development, there seemed to be, that I can't think that the process has changed in respect to that, if that's where you're going. Or you're thinking, is this post the Bella Vista the work being stopped there?
It's just notable, I think, that we responded to the fact that we were supposedly,
Yeah.
you know, stonewalling. Then we get to a situation where clearly we're too lenient. You know, we're not picking up on things.
Yeah.
But that BDO report did recommend improvement to our city plan in regard to earthworks. Of course, that's not something you can do very fast.
No.
I just wondered if there were any other things that leapt out, and maybe you needed more preparation.
Yeah,
to sort
well,
of delve
I
into
haven't read the BDO report for a while, but there was one thing in the BDO report, I think we only talked to sort of snippets of it, and the one thing was they thought that the single point of contact was, you know, okay, which we can't disagree with, but I think you need your policy and procedure needs to capture that if you think it's a good idea. So we've said that on some sites it could be a good thing, right? But it needs to be tailored to the specific job. So, and the council, I think one of the things they picked up on early was the whole sort of earthquakes thing, where you've got large excavations. That's something that we thought, to our mind, the building consent process was, a lot of the stuff was being loaded. There was potential to deal with it back here. We're not experts on the Resource Management Act, but we do observe how others councils do it. So we thought that they were sort of it was putting pressure on the building consent process to tidy up some measures that could have been dealt with earlier on, and that's why we brought the Ministry for the Environment into the conversation. We gave them a draft of the report. We've talked to them a number of times, and they don't have the similar sort of responsive team that we do in MB, so they're developing that capability at the moment. So I think in future you might see them more deeply involved in conversations like this.
Just in your required actions, the point 2 is that we develop policies and procedures regarding the need to identify critical measurements, e.g. boundary measurements, site levels and floor levels, and make sure these are made a condition of the building consent process. Now, we have responded to that in what we will come to next, but I just wanted to get your opinion. I don't think you mean, but I may be wrong, that you're talking about having site levels, boundary measurements, you know, done on every lot across the city as a result, because what people are concerned about is you get something like this happen,
Pendulum
then we
swings.
go overboard with red tape and further costs, and I know developers have had concerns about having to do these surveys. It adds considerable cost every section.
Yeah.
So is that what you're saying to us, or you're saying just in the circumstances where it's obvious that that sort of requirement is needed, whether it's, you know...
Oh, I think, yeah, there is an element of being site-specific. You sort of, I suppose you could, particularly on these sites where they're very small allotments, there's a lot of site coverage, and I think there's a number of buildings that are within the metre to the boundary, which is a problem, right? And so they had to fire rate those because they were within the spread of fire limitations that the acceptable solution provides for. So I think in that sense, you're penalising whoever it is to a much higher degree, trying to fire rate a building post-design and putting down the foundations than you are getting a surveyor on site once. So I think it's there is an element case by case. If you were on a big site and there's lots of space and the boundary considerations are not such that as they were on this site, you could apply a level of discretion for sure. But in this instance, on a sloping site where you're trying to establish sort of reduced levels from plans and things like that, and you're, you know, in relation to the boundary, I would think it's a no-brainer to get an expert in to actually, for everyone's sake, to actually get that house in the right position.
But I think, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think I'm hearing you say that some common sense should apply.
Oh,
You know,
most
you've got
definitely.
a massive development with all
Yeah.
flat sites. You're not
Yep.
talking about running around and...
No,
You know,
no. I mean, I think if, you know, a good example would be a rural site, right, where your boundary's 30 metres away. I think that would be an absolute waste of time, unless you had, if there was some sort of other utility or something else on site that you might build upon. You might want some certainty around your clearances from those sorts of things. But if you're just on a good piece of land out in the middle of a paddock, I would think you're over regulating.
Thanks very much, Paul, for your report and your presentation. Can you expand a little bit on the aspect of sequencing on site? My understanding is that there was some difference of opinion between the need to retain the cut before building, as opposed to building and then retaining. And I think this goes back to the conflict between the Resource Management Act and our city plan. Can you just give your observation on that aspect, and also if the retaining had been fully completed before any buildings were erected, do you think that would have had a massively or a large different outcome?
So what we observed in this situation, so we visited other sites around where retaining walls had been put in. So there was a building consent uplifted with the earthworks consent to put retaining walls across. And I suppose the complicating factor for this site is you would have a retaining wall that's bridging multiple sites. So it's quite hard to, if you're building buildings and they're stepping in and out and stuff, to actually get earth moving equipment, and in this case some pretty big gear to drill some piles that might go down 4 or 5 metres, right? So you're thinking of a big auger that's got to get into a building, behind a building that's only got sort of 1 and 2 metres clearance. It's quite a hard thing to retrofit a retaining wall of that type. So just in terms of the sequencing, that was quite a big ask to think that would ever happen because the houses were built. The thing with the way the building consents were structured, there were retaining walls included on the consent, but it wasn't clear, and as we talked to in the report, it wasn't clear who was responsible for building those retaining walls, and it turned out, from what we can gather, that was not part of the building contract, and it was specifically excluded, in which case the building owners then had to engage either the developer, which would be the most obvious thing, or someone else to build these retaining walls. So the problem was, it's not unprecedented to build something without put a building platform down without not doing some enabling work first, right? So I wouldn't recommend it, but it's not unprecedented. The problem is that when the erosion and things started occurring on site, that becomes a code compliance issue. So the building code in a couple of sections around structure and construction and demolition hazards speaks to maintaining a safe and amenable site, and this clearly wasn't. And then you had another regulator come in and observe that it wasn't being work safe and issue an abatement notice, which essentially closed the site down. So that's not a great outcome. So yeah, that's why our recommendations, as far as we could go, in around our observations around earthworks, bearing in mind that we aren't the regulators in that space. The council have moved already to adopt some policies from other councils. And I think the other thing too to bear in mind is probably you're going to see a little bit more of this type of excavation where you've opened up some new motorways and it's opened up access to different land than you've developed on. So you really need to be looking at how you deal with that type of situation better in the future, particularly for large scale developments. Yeah.
Thank you. Can you just elaborate a bit more about, it wasn't clear who was to build the retaining walls? Did you say it wasn't in the contract?
Yeah, that's as far as we've been able to establish, and that was in talking to a few people and reviewing documentation. So yeah, it wasn't clear to us who was the responsible party to actually erect those retaining walls, which, I suppose the council aren't in that level of detail in terms of how things are contracted, right? But once the walls weren't there and the building platforms are in place and you can see some problems with the site eroding and there's some of the runoff and other sort of consequential damage that was occurring, you really need to act. And that was one of our recommendations around using some of your powers, whether that be under the Building Act or the Resource Management Act, that there was opportunities to sort of stop and say, what are we going to do here? This is not, we haven't got a co-compliant situation. Yeah.
And just another question, earlier on you said you interviewed around 2,000 people. Can you just tell me that,
Cross-section?
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you. Types of people.
So I would say the vast majority of those people would have been current or past building control staff within the council. And then we talked to engineers, designers, the developer we talked to, and we talked to representatives from other local government or central government, or local government too. We talked to Ministry for the Environment, and we talked to LGNZ, local government, New Zealand, and who else? Oh, IANZ was obviously another party that we were having conversations with on a fairly regular basis here. So the accreditation body, we were seeking information from them, and also keeping them abreast of what we've found with the council. So that's pretty much, I think, it in terms of our interviews for the sake of the report. Yeah.
Thank you.
Just a supplementary question in relation to that wall. I mean, you know, when you build a house and you probably get the doors with it and the windows, you don't think to check that, you do.
Yeah.
But would most builders, when they're building a house and the wall is integral to part of that, include that? I mean, what's the normal practice
It is
throughout
fairly
New Zealand?
standard, yeah. That's,
To include
Yeah.
a necessary
Yeah,
part
yeah.
of the infrastructure.
yeah, enabling
And not
works.
to come back and say you've got to pay for that
No,
separately.
No, that would not be standard practice.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank
And
you.
that's only my sort of opinion, but we've seen, you know, other councils would do that, and we've seen on your own sites. If we went and visited a couple of sites here in Tauranga as part of this review, and we observed that that's what was happening on other sites. So I suppose it's a different approach from different developers. Yeah.
Very different to me, but anyway. Councillor Granger.
Yeah, just coming back to retaining walls again, and it's been a problem for me to get my head around a few areas of that. The effect of, due to the complex, you know, site and the contour of the ground, and you mentioned too that retaining walls were not part of the building contract. Did the council staff at any stage advise the developer to build these walls? Or in that case, if not, should they have advised the developer?
Yeah, there's probably a couple of points to clarify there. So there's retaining walls that are integral to the house itself. So this is like block walls that are cut into a slope, and then they've got free draining material around them. Those walls were part of the building consent, and then there's the enabling ones that stop the site itself, any lateral spread that would occur or anything like that would retain that, so that those parts weren't they were part of the consent, but they weren't part of the contract. Yeah. So I forgot the last part of your question there, mate. So.
It's just my concern here is that the effect of let's go back a little bit of history. The building inspectors of past that have been around, built a lot, done a lot, and they've got that knowledge on board. The thing is when you go in on site and say, well, hang on a tick, you see the building, because, as I said, because of the contour of the ground, isn't it common sense lacking here to the effect of passing something back onto the developer to say that there should be something done?
Yeah, and there was a meeting on site where one of the inspectors expressed some concerns about the mass excavation and what was happening on site. And that's when there was a bit of a change, a departure from normal process. So there was some, that's one of the things we saw and we tracked down some documentary evidence of an exchange of emails that sort of said all work will halt on site, and it seems that person wasn't involved in the work from that time on. And I guess what we've said too is once the council became aware that there was an issue with potential land collapsing on the dwellings themselves, that should have been dealt with a notice to fix. So the council has this thing, if there's a contravention under the Building Act, there's this notice that's a prescribed form, the council fill it out, and that can do all manner of things. It can stop work, can require people to do some remedial action, all sorts of things. So those notices weren't issued when they should have, in our view.
Thanks, Paul. I've just got one more question and then we'll move on to our response. There was a point in this process where I believe that a request was made from the builder or developer or whatever you want to call them for a single point of contact inspector, but that inspector just happened to be the one they wanted, was someone who just happened to be having a house built by the developer. Do you think it was good management decision to accede to that sort of a request?
Well, I think in the report we've sort of talked about the Auditor General's guidance around matters of conflict of interest and things like that. We didn't look deeply into that, but that's one of the areas. So one of the regulations for accreditation talk about conflicts of interest. So that in when Irons visit later this year, they'll be taking a keen interest in that. But I would think you need to carefully manage situations like that. And I know other stuff's playing out within council that sort of gave us the confidence not to dig too deeply into some areas where we don't really have a legislative mandate. So we just thought it was worth mentioning, and we've referred through to those audited general sort of guidance.
Well, thank you, Paul.
No worries.
Thanks for coming up and addressing the report. We've had it for a few weeks and, yeah, very
Yep, all
detailed.
right.
Thank you.
Thanks for your time. Yep.
So we'll now go on to DC 82, which is the Tauranga City Council's response to the MB report on Bella Vista. And, yep, Ray, you're going to leave that off. Thanks.
Thank you, Your Worship. DC 82, I believe, is quite self-explanatory. You will note that the 10 points raised by MB are addressed in the report, the dark itemised matters there, and you'll see our response as we go through. I think it's important to note on page 3 the timeline that we have established. So we're well on the way to addressing these concerns, and then by September we'll be in a good place for our audit. So happy to answer any questions, and I have Shay Harrop here, who's been more involved than I have, to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Ray. Just wanted to follow on from my questions to Paul in regard to this, not overdoing it really. I note in the on page 263 on the second sort of bolded area, the first one, the office system that TCC uses in building consent has a statement that covers the requirement to ensure that a survey certificate is provided which will ensure critical measurements are considered. The quality manual has been reviewed to ensure this process is included and supported by the required guidance. I'm hoping for some assurance that we're not going to go over the top here, that we will, as has been pretty clearly said, make it site specific and not add costs where they're not needed, do our job properly, but not imply the whole city has to start doing this. Please.
Through the chair. In terms of that is noted, and you'll note we're talking about a guidance note, or a practice note, to then be able to provide that to the industry and also to staff to provide guidance around that. Some of the things we've looked at from other councils and other areas up and down the country is if, say, 1.5 is the requirement or 1 metre if it's for fire rating, if you're within sort of 200 mil of that, then that requirement would go on because 200 mil variance isn't unusual. But if you're over that sort of distance, then it would be unrequired.
I'll just emphasise it again. Thanks, Shay. But I've watched the progression of guidance notes to become laws, over time. And so unless we counter that drift, because when people work in a regulatory environment, they tend to want to make sure their butts are covered. And so they tend to go further than what is necessary. We unfortunately live in an environment where people don't take risks anymore with common sense kind of thing. So we need to make sure not only in the notes, but in the training of our staff, the ongoing training, that we clarify, please, note that is advisory, site-specific, so that we don't go down that track.
Noted.
I'm not sure if it's Ray or Shay. Have you got the resources to implement all of these recommendations in time and the management support?
Under Regulation 8, we're required to consider our resourcing for our day-to-day job, not for these additional things. We have been in discussions about potentially getting some contract support and building a business case for preparing for September, because there's an additional load, and we have been using internal resources up until here to support the investigations and things as well. So I guess it's a bit of a watch this space.
don't want to watch this space. I want to guarantee that we've got the resources. Perhaps it,
through the chair, yeah, absolutely. If we don't have staff in-house, we have the ability to contract in, and I guess that offer has been made, and I've encouraged both Shay and Ray to do that.
Thank you. Two questions to staff. The training schedule and audit activity on page 265, most of it appears to be audit activity. So I'd just like to know what we used to do in terms of audit. Is this a step up? Is it expanded a lot more? And what are the outcomes of the audits? And another question I'll have after that, if I may, please.
Okay, so we have always had a regular audit regime, and we've met our IANZ obligations for that. But I guess when any failure is put up, you increase your review of that, and we're going into more detail. We have a new quality specialist joined us in September, and that has also given us the capacity to increase our audit regime. And every time leading into an accreditation, we do an end-to-end audit, probably additional to what we normally would. So this isn't, I guess, too far out of the norm. The only benefit is we've got some key areas to target and work on leading into our accreditation and the revisit from MB.
And the second question, Paul talked about the currency of technical knowledge and the training schedule. Where do you factor in keeping up with technology and the changes that it brings and making sure our staff are absolutely up to date that they can be?
Yep. So this has been an ongoing challenge for every BCA through the building boom, and we have developed a number of systems and training programs in that space. But with this, we're keen to make sure we review that and consider that we are tracking in the right track. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. To the Chief Executive, I appreciate that the timeline of events occurred prior to your tenure at this organisation. Within the response to MB, we have undertaken to give quite a bit of training in different areas to our building activity. But, and this is a personal view, I would expect that as well as training, there is a need for some internal accountability and consequences. Can I be, within the bounds of being a good employer, can I be given an assurance that there will be that internal accountability and internal consequences?
Through the chair, there is another inquiry currently underway, and I'm expecting a draft report within a fortnight in relation to the roles, responsibilities, the performance and the accountability of individuals throughout this process. And it's that report that I will look to see whether or not there's any further action required in relation to individuals within the organisation and the part that played, and whether or not there needs to be some accountability held.
Yeah, a couple of the main problems there was the retaining wall and stormwater control, both which really are, given the site, a huge common sense factor. But I would like some assurance that immediately there won't be any repeat of that in terms of allowing people to build, because that's pretty important that we make sure that doesn't happen again right now. I'd like some assurance that that is the case.
Through the chair. We, I guess, are using the MB report to support us maintaining our position as regulators, and we feel supported by the organisation to follow our practices and procedures.
through the chair, so the staff are working on an earthworks plan change. The time frame for that is for it to come back to council August or September, so it can go out for public notification in advance of the elections. If we waited to post that, it would have to wait until early 2020, so that's on track at this current time. It will be reported back through the Urban Form and Transport Development Committee.
Can I, just as you do, Mr. Chairman, I just wondered if you might consider adding and supported to it, because this is a situation where it's more than just receiving a report. I would like to indicate support in the resolution by, the recommendations in front of us. Would that be okay with you as movement?
Support for the actions that are being undertaken to address the problem, yes. So in that case, it would be that the Tauranga City Council receives the response and supports the actions contained therein. So have I got a second for that? Councillor Mason. Anybody wish to say anything further? Okay. Speakers. Okay, so I'll put that all in favour, say aye. Aye. Against. So that's carried. Thanks very much, Shay and Paul. And we do have one further matter regarding Bella Vista, which is the update, DC 77. You're welcome to stay for it if you want, but you may have flights to catch. So DC 77, that's page 256. Okay. Thanks, Nick.
Thank you, sir. I am happy to talk through the report, but I think it's quite brief and very self-explanatory, so perhaps I might take it as read for this particular one, and happy to answer any questions.
Councillors, have you got any questions for Nick over this report? Pretty well relating to the expenditure. Yes, Councillor Stewart.
Thank you. Through the chair, just regarding the site security costs, can you just please clarify those for me?
Through the chair, could I just check what you want to clarify, Councillor Stewart?
Just the quantum of the site security costs, please.
So most of that cost was reported through in terms of the last report, DC 360. There has been ongoing security, which we have changed the provisioning of that security over in the last quarter. So there is minimal cost now on an ongoing basis. So most of that is the cost that we've actually incurred up to date, with minimal cost going forward now.
Thank you for clarifying.
Thank you. A question to our Chief Executive. Can you please confirm that once this whole sorry saga is over and we have tallied up all of the costs and then the revenue that will come back to us from the sale of the land, there will be a full reconciliation so that we can go out to our community and say this whole saga had a net cost of X?
Yes, we can undertake to do that.
For following up the question of Councillor Kelvin Clout, it was reported in the media, Your Worship, that you made a statement about break even. The word, I think, break even was used. Can you clarify possibly what you meant in terms of break even?
What I meant was that I was hopeful that by the time we added up all the costs, that's all the costs, and the insurance, and then the funds that we received for eventually remediating or selling the remediated sections, I was hoping that we might be able to break even. Yeah, so that's my hope. Whether we can or not, but yeah, I think that's something we should aim for, that's for sure. Yeah.
Ask the Chief Executive, and I know it's a difficult situation, whether he has a view on that, because looking at the numbers, I'm struggling to see how that's possible.
Through the chair, my sense is that there will be still a significant cost to the ratepayer throughout this process. So the cost of purchase may well be offset by the recovery through insurance and potential sale of the land. The operational costs, including the security and range of different work streams, in my view, will be the cost that the organisation and the ratepayer bears. And at this stage, it would be up around the $4 million mark.
Perhaps my hope is not as founded as I'd hoped for. Okay, Councillor Mason.
Just a question, are we all squared up with the homeowners in terms of all, money's paid and compensation and all the different things? Just like to draw a line under that at some point.
Yes. The answer is yes.
Okay, somebody prepared to move A, B and C? Councillor Baldock, seconded. Councillor Clout, want to speak to that?
Yes, I will. I think it's worth just having a little bit of a review of the whole thing. I know we've made many speeches on this over the last year, but the summary of MBIE's key findings gives a summary of April 1 year ago. We issued the notices, the dangerous and affected buildings notices. In June, we unanimously agreed to purchase the properties. We settled in November, and we are still working through the aftermath of all of this. And so I continue to support whatever expenditure we have to make to see this right through. And there will always be an element of unknowns as we go through it. So increasing the delegation of Chief Executive, I think, makes good sense. We remember in the Heath report that he urged council to be the one that steps into this problem because there was no one else around with the pockets to help out the homeowners and also to resolve it. I think we all share the Mayor's concern, hope that we can narrow that gap as much as possible when it comes to the resale. But, it's been a rough year and it's been particularly tough for all the homeowners. I know when I first saw the site out there, I was shocked, and I think anybody would have been shocked at the conditions they were living in. And you kind of had to ask the question, how did this happen and how did they move into a situation like this? Council has had real failings that's been identified, clarified. We are now working on the resolutions. But it is clear in my mind, and I hope in other councillors' minds, I think so from some of the comments that have been made, had those retaining walls been done by the developer, and it's hard to believe any serious developer would have done it any other way, given the size of the cuts into that hillside. Had those retaining walls been put in, the damage, even with our failings, the damages would have been so much less. We could well have been remediating properties now, not having to remove them because of the unknowns of the geotech damage done underneath the very building platforms from water and so on getting in. So I just want to make that point again, that this whole disaster started because a developer, in my opinion, went ahead with the project, had not even, I don't think ever intended to do those walls because of the cost of them. We've had reports to us what the retaining is going to cost, and if you add that to the prices that were being offered, it's just an impossible development to have ever succeeded. So I'm pleased, and I am pleased and proud of our response, despite all the criticism in the community, that a year later, all the homeowners have been taken care of. Yes, there was all sorts of argy-bargy about the price, but I believe when you look at the situation in Christchurch and the fact that people are still trying to get resolution to their issues from the Earthquake and War Damage Commission and insurance companies and so on, I believe we have worked as fast as we could, as openly and transparently as we could. Yes, there's lessons to be learned along the way, both through the process and the whole building consent lessons that can be learnt. But soon this sorry saga will come to a conclusion, and we'll see some fit-for-purpose houses back on that site, because this city desperately needs every square centimetre of ground we've got for housing going forward. So I support the resolution.
I agree with much of what the mover said, but I think one day when the story is truly written, I imagine when we're long gone from here and someone chooses to write the story, they will see that time between Heath's report and actually settling to be longer than was necessary. I don't think we've done as good a job, in my view, as we could have, in terms of, and there were reasons for that, and I think some of those reasons will come up later this afternoon. But I think where we are, and we can't change what's been, the way we're moving forward is correct. I think we're right to increase the delegation to make this happen. We just really need to learn lessons, and I think we need to make sure that there's no rewriting of history ever on this. Ever. No rewriting of history ever on this. Eventually it'll all come public one way or another, even if it's deathbed confessions. I think we've done okay, considering, but, you know, we're at fault here. We've got egg on our face. We're not looking good, but we are where we are.
Just one point I do want to mention here, picking up on Councillor Baldock's comments. A good example as regards to retaining, if you do get the opportunity and a chance to, there's a subdivision as we speak, out at Welcome Bay Road, the corner of Welcome Bay Road and Waikiti Road, and that gives you a very good example of what is being retained, and we're talking about probably close to 75, near on 80% of those sections being retained. Gives you a good example, and not one house has been built on it yet.
Just briefly, if I may, I just want to point out that the will of the council through this whole saga, I believe, was to get in and fix this as fast as we possibly could. We just wanted to get in and look after our community. It took longer than we wanted, but that was certainly the will of the council at the time.
You just have a question, if I might just ask Nick. Given that these houses had to be built in this particular state, and the building company went into liquidation, and I understand from news reports the receiver was looking for money, perhaps $1.5 million, if I remember. If the receiver was able to get that money back from the builder, what would happen to that money? Would it go in any way to recompense costs to the ratepayer, or would that go to subbies, or what would happen if that was to ever occur? Not that I believe it will.
I'll have to come back to you on that particular one. I'm not sure off the top of my head as to who's getting priority as creditors in this situation. So look, I'll come back on that particular question.
I was just making the point that these houses did not just materialise in the state that they were in, they had to be built. Okay, other speakers? Councillor Mason.
There's a lot of talk about money and whether we're going to make anything, well, how much we're going to lose and the rest of the community in that, but just want to just acknowledge the incredible hardship that the homeowners have had, and I think that should be our first priority. The immense stress that they've been under, and just to acknowledge the dignity with which they've undertaken this, and yeah, we wish them the very, very best for the future.
Put that, all in favour say aye. Aye. Against. So that's carried. Thanks very much. Right, that leads us to our final report. Then our final report today, but it is a lengthy one, is DC 88, an independent review of projects undertaken by Tauranga City Council in relation to 4 different projects. So the author of the report, Max, if you want to present what you would like to present, and then the will be questions, no doubt. So.
Thank you, Your Worship. Good afternoon, councillors and senior staff. Firstly, I just wanted to congratulate the Council and Chief Executive for undertaking these reviews in such an open manner. I think it sends just an excellent message of transparency to the community, and I don't believe every council would act so openly, so I think it's something that should be noted. What I'm proposing to do is give quite a brief overview of the content in my reports. There doesn't seem to be a lot of point in me spending a lot of time covering material that presumably you've already read. Now, the purpose of the study was to identify what had caused the dissatisfaction in the community that had arisen following the outcome of these 4 projects. And clearly it was to see what lessons could be learnt for the future to attempt to ensure that there wasn't a repeat of the same type of outcome. When reaching my conclusions, I've treated the various projects as being representative of projects generally. Of course, I only looked at 4. So I'm assuming they're representative, and it's on that basis that I have reached my conclusions. I also just want to stress what my brief wasn't, and that was not to review the technical or design elements of projects. It wasn't, for example, for me to have a view on whether the design for the redevelopment of Coolum Park is a good design or not. I know that you are having some work undertaken separately to get a view on that matter. I'm now going to cover the 4 projects just quite briefly, just one slide on each. There's a lot of detail in the individual reports, which I'm not going to go over. This particular project, obviously, the driver of the dissatisfaction is the perception that there's greater congestion through Greaton Village. Now, at the time I did my review, and I think it's still the same, there is in fact no data available to say whether there is greater congestion or not. However, you will have noted that traffic modelling that was done predicted that there would likely be increased congestion. Many users of the area are saying there is increased congestion. So you would think there's a good chance that there probably is increased congestion when you put those things together. But there is no data, and I understand some work is being done to be able to look at that in a more deliberate manner. It's also worth noting that the modelling that was done didn't predict that a good road was going to become a poor performing road. It predicted that an already poor performing road was going to become poorer. And those two things are quite different. Probably the key finding when I looked at this particular project was that the traffic modelling information that did signal that things were going to get worse was not provided to the community. So when the community was consulted about this project, it was not given that information. The community's response to consultation may well have been quite different if it had been told that traffic conditions were likely to get worse as a result of this project. Moving to Phoenix Car Park development, o Te Papa o Ngā Manu Poratakataka. There is a mix of potential causes of the dissatisfaction that surrounds this project. And firstly, I'd like to touch on what I'd regard as some historical ones. And that is, the first of those is that there's been a lot of consultation done about this particular project, and at every stage of that consultation, there was significant opposition to it. So, with that background alone, it's not surprising that there's still opposition to a finished product. The second issue is that certainly what I read in the media about the project is there's a lot of concern that what was delivered was an urban space and not a green space. Well, the records of the council that I have been through tell me that it was always signalled to be an urban space and not a green space. Even back in 2013, that distinction was made. Sure, some artists' impressions of the job may be flashier than others, but it has always been shown as a project that was substantially concrete with some green stuff scattered around it to break up the effect of it. In terms of the project itself, however, there were some issues. The first one of those is that the project was never costed. There was a budget for the project, which was a budget in the sense that council had provided a sum of money to do this work. But the actual project had moved to quite an advanced stage. It had already been approved by council, in fact, when the first costing of the project was done. And that costing showed that in actual fact the budget was quite insufficient for the project that had been signalled to the community. In fact, the budget that existed was only about 60% of the actual project cost. So that was clear, in my view, was clearly a failure. It was not reported to council. There were a couple of opportunities that the council could have, if it wished to, in fact, save the project in the sense of constructing what had originally been approved. But on each of those occasions, that information was not brought forward to the council. So what was ultimately constructed had a lower standard of amenity to the project that was actually approved. And that may well be another factor in the community being dissatisfied with the project. Coolum Park is an interesting one. It was effectively a development of the park, which I know has not yet actually happened because the design is being reviewed, but primarily it involved relocating the vehicle pathway through the reserve to the rear of the reserve so that the use of the green reserve was not broken up by traffic movements and parking and the like. There was a very substantial community engagement plan developed for this work, but it wasn't followed. The plan indicated that the community would be consulted on 3 separate occasions about this project. But after the second round of consultation, the team who were responsible for the work considered they had the information that they needed and did not undertake the third stage of consultation. I would like to say that in my view, having 3 rounds of consultation for a project like this is overkill. You'd have to have people who were pretty enthusiastic to keep responding 3 times about a small project like this. But be that as it may, the community was told there would be 3 rounds and there were only 2. So it was quite a failure. The Surf Club project is an interesting one. As you all know, the project is primarily owned by the Surf Club, which is the building of a new club rooms. But the council had a part to play in that, and for the purpose of this exercise was primarily about replacing the public toilets, and in particular putting in a wastewater pumping station. Excuse me. The causes for for the problems that arose, which effectively were that the timing of the construction of the pump station prevented the surf club getting access to the basement of its building, which meant that it was difficult for it to commence its beach patrols. The fact that the pump station was unlikely to be built in time for the beach patrols should have been obvious to staff very early on in the project, but it was not. It was not signalled to the surf club. And throughout the project, the surf club was being given information that was not correct about the likely time it could access its building, and sometimes it was not given information. There was significant need for managing relationships with the surf club, but there was no person nominated for that task. So it's not surprising to see that the project would not have run well. In my view, the surf club also received less than ideal customer service. There were issues that needed to be fixed to enable them to commence beach patrols, and invariably they were fixed, but it was not done at all proactively. And this was really when we get to the recommendations later, one of them is about what I consider the culture of the organisation issue, which is a focus on tasks rather than a focus on outcomes. And this one's probably the best example of that, where there was a very definite focus on building a pump station. There was far less focus in doing what it takes to enable this very important community service to get underway. So the recommendations, effectively, I have talked about the first one, the culture issue. I think that at least in those 4 projects, it indicated consistently that there was a culture that focused on task completion rather than outcomes. The second one, project management, I have also referred to that one as well when I mentioned that there was no project plan whatsoever for the surf club project, even though it involved multiple parts of the organisation. But there was at least one other example, and I'll refer to the Phoenix car park. And that is, in that particular situation, again, you had multiple arms of the council involved. But the person that who controlled the budget did not control the project, and that led to some issues. Whoops, wrong one. Recommendation 3 is about stakeholder engagement, and the key issue there is that the council doesn't appear to have any organisational guidelines or protocols for undertaking engagement. There's no common approach. Now, some of the approaches to the community engagement I saw were quite good, but they were variable. I've referred to Coolin Park already, where in my view there's too much of it. If you look at the Greerton project, you had the situation where not all the necessary people were consulted. For example, people who lived around the area were consulted. The people that drive through the area who would be affected by congestion were not. Also in that particular one, there was a situation where the business group in Greerton was consulted via its association rather than directly. And of course, when you've got an association with many members, they're not all going to have exactly the same view. And it's definitely good practice to go to the people directly as well as to the association. And the final one of my recommendations, which is about costs and budgets, again I referred to the situation in the Phoenix car park project where there was insufficient or almost none costing undertaken. But there's also an issue with the Coolin Park project, which I know is yet to be constructed. But the cost of the project that was being consulted on was almost twice the available budget. Now, whether the change in scope of that project will impact community satisfaction, I guess only time will tell. So, Your Worship, that is the end of my brief presentation as promised. I'm happy to attempt to answer any questions.
Couple of questions, if I may. The first, through Your Worship, to the Chief Executive. The cost of this exercise is?
Are you talking about the review?
Yes.
I don't have the exact cost, but I can. I
That
would
can be circulated?
Sorry?
That can be circulated?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
No, thank you.
Yeah.
A second question, if I may, to Max, and it's slightly tangential in a way. We have a report, Max, and in the agenda on page 271, it talks about significance and engagement on para 13, and it says, under the significance and engagement policy 2014, this report is of low significance as it is presented for information purposes only. This is a report that seems to suggest we need to change our culture, address major project management deficiencies, sort out our comms and community engagement, and develop some ability to budget. How in the hell can that possibly be of low significance? And, you know, it's just, it beggars belief, and I think it goes to the underlying cultural issues that we may face at a higher level. And in that regard, Your Worship, I'll give notice I'd like to move an amended recommendation when discussion is complete.
Yes. No, I think I can respond. The everyday English language of significance is different to the meaning of significance in terms of the legislation. So what's in that report, I'm sure, is quite accurate in the sense of the legislation, but to a lay reader, I'm sure it looks odd.
We've always had problems with that significance policy. It's just an example of the sort of gobbledygook under which we have to operate sometimes in assessing whether things are significant or not.
Yeah, my point, I suppose, just, and you make the point, Max, to a lay reader, the people of this community are lay readers of our documents. To use language that obscures and obfuscates major organisational issues or suggests that they're actually not significant is just bizarre, given the light of other topics we've had in this chamber today.
Hey, thank you, Max, and thanks for your comprehensive report. Just a comment you made here, and it's basically saying if better performances to be achieved by council staff, the culture with the staff has to change so that the community is at the forefront of all services and projects provided. Now, the question I want to ask you, and hopefully, and I'd like a response from our CEO, that would be grateful. The question I want to ask is simply this: if the culture does not change, neither will the performance.
Well, that's correct, yeah.
You intend to comment further on that?
In my reports, I'm concluding that the culture is the cause of a lot of the issues that are facing. So I could only conclude if the culture didn't change, that it would continue to be the cause of problems.
Now, perhaps through the chair, if it's okay with you, could we have a response from our CEO?
Changing culture isn't like flicking a switch. It involves people, processes, systems, structures, and leadership. And essentially, my task and the task of the executive team working with councillors is to change that over a period of time. It's what I'm employed to do. It's what my colleagues are employed to do. And there's a number of things that we've started already to affect that culture changes, but it's not like flicking a switch. It'll take a period of time. I'd ask that councillors and community work with us throughout that change.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'll I'll just stick to questions at this point and save my comments to the debate. Max, thanks for your report. I've got three questions, one on the Greton, one on the Coolum Park, and one on the Te Papa o Ngā Manu Porotakataka. In Greton, when you make the point that there was a consultant's report that traffic congestion or traffic flow would be worse, it was an F-rated road, as you've said, or a poorly performing, and it would be a little bit more poorly performing. So F to F, whatever it was. I think you had a suggestion or a discussion about this. It would be F4 instead of F8. Are you aware whether that consultant's report was taking into account the obvious growth that was going to occur because of Pies Pa, the lakes exploding with all the sections out there now being filled when they made that assessment, or was it solely on the design of the new road? Because I'm a regular user, I go through there probably more than anyone around this table, and I know it has got worse, but I'm not sure if it's the design or just 2 years of growth and other factors.
My understanding of the advice from Invivo was that it was referring to the effects of the project.
And was it the effects of the pedestrian crossing having a traffic light, or the effects of the narrowing of, the one-lane roundabouts being put at either end? Is that identifiable or not?
I am going from memory here, and perhaps this would need to be verified, but I seem to recall in the advice there was reference specifically to the pedestrian crossing.
Thank you for that. To Coolum Park, what we've heard from those who've recently come in urging us to review it is that one of the aspects is that the people who use the park are not residents around it, and they're not necessarily people who drive in and park anywhere under the trees and have a picnic. It is people who are transport disadvantaged or disabled in some way, and the only way they can enjoy that harbour view there is that they come in a car, either driven by somebody or themselves, and they enjoy the park where they can sit, maybe eat their lunch in the car. Are you aware of any consultation that was directed at that particular sector of our community who value that opportunity to park right on the waterfront, because that's what's being removed in the current design?
I don't have any specific knowledge of consultation with that particular group, but equally I couldn't say it didn't happen. What I do seem to recall is that in the development plan there was provision being made for people with disabilities to be able to park their vehicles over near the boat club. I think that was part of the design. Again, that would need to be verified.
Thank you. And last question in regard to Ngā Manu and the Te Papa o Ngā Manu Porotakataka Park. Muff that up. The original budget of 2 million was simply DC contributions, was it not?
That's what I understand.
Probably not the best way to start the project, as you've pointed out, with simply money, because there's a reluctance in this organisation to spend money. I don't know if you've become aware of that, but having a pot of money that is DC funded was a lot of the initiative for doing something in that park. Did you find that out as you went through?
Well, my answer is probably not specifically about the development contribution part of it, but I don't see it unusual at an early stage of a project to having some sort of broad sum of money provided. But what I would expect is that as the project moves on, it starts to get refined, and the costing gets refined throughout, so that there is the ability to to change it, or I guess to not even do it. So I don't think the approach in itself of just having a sum of money was necessarily unusual.
Max, your remit was to look at the operational, project management and staff-related concerns. But my view is that there are no bad soldiers, only bad generals. What could we around this table have done better?
Look, I don't think I can answer that question. I did mention in my overall report, although I didn't, in my presentation, I didn't put up a recommendation about it, but there did seem to be some need for a consistent approach towards how staff brought forward information to the elected members and when they should do it. I know that your committee structure has since changed and that may well have been overcome, but I remember, I think the first project that I actually wrote the report on was the Phoenix car park one. And one of the things I was looking at then, that was a project where there was a lot of reporting to council. And when I was looking at how that was done, I remember when I looked at the committee structure, I couldn't work out which committee it should go to. I think I came up with 3 that it could go to. Now, I know that's all changed, but there was quite extensive reporting on that project, yet it didn't seem to be the case necessarily in other projects. So what came through to me that there wasn't a consistent approach that was necessarily well understood. But beyond that, I couldn't comment.
I could probably say, if I was cheeky, that if the generals had followed the advice of the field marshal, may have turned out differently, but however that would be. Yeah, Councillor Mason.
The supplementary, I guess, is, I guess what I'm trying to explore is that could some of these projects have been monitored better if we had asked better questions from the governance perspective? You know, there's an imperative on governance to question and not to take, I mean, the budgetary question, not having a budget, or having a budget but not having, detailed financial projections. Is that not something that we should have picked up somewhere along the line?
The value of these projects were of a scale that I would expect in a council the size of Tauranga City Council that you wouldn't be looking closely at them, that they would be projects that you would approve. You'd have some level of knowledge of them, you'd have some level of monitoring, but I think you would be relying on council staff to make them happen.
Thank you, Max, for that. I do remember going to at least one public meeting at Greaton, and that was in the Greaton Hall, where I don't believe anybody spoke up with any significant questions about the project, which I found quite surprising on the day. The other question I've got is with the Te Papa o ngā Manupō Takataka Park. Looking at at your report, it seemed there was only about 50-50 or maybe 55-45 support for it. Would you, in your opinion, have progressed a significant piece of work like that that's got quite engages a lot of community passion with that sort of support, limited support?
I'm going to evade that one by saying I wouldn't possibly have the knowledge of the project that you would have around the council chamber, so I couldn't substitute my view for yours.
Thank you, Chancellor. Oh, sorry, Mr. Mayor. In terms of the Te Papa o ngā Manupō Takataka and the Greaton project, both projects had reports which the elected representatives of our residents did not see, according to my recollection. One was in terms of the traffic flow likely being made worse. The second one was in regard to the urban space. Was it back in August 2017 the organisation became aware that the project cost was going to be a significant addition to what was in the budget. In both those cases, the elected representatives were not made aware, to my recollection, of those facts. is that common amongst other councils in New Zealand? And I'm also reminded of the saying, you have not received because you did not ask. So is there a governance responsibility there as well, or am I being too hard on myself?
I can't comment on practice throughout local government in New Zealand. What I would say in those two issues that you raise, in each of them, I would have expected that they would have got reported to the elected council.
Did the elected council err because it did not ask? I mean, it's hard to know the answer to the question, which you don't know about, but should the elected council have exercised a greater oversight of these projects and been more inquisitive of them throughout the process? Or is that an unfair observation?
I think you have to look at the respective roles of elected councillors and staff, and your role is to make the big decisions, and you also have a responsibility to have in place some form of monitoring that gives you an idea, at least a high level, how the organisation is going. As I think I've already said, the two projects in terms of their value, I would not expect them to be high on the monitoring radar for that reason alone. So, yeah. Sorry, that's not directly answering your question.
Thank you very much, Max, for your expert work. It looks like you've identified a fair degree of staff working in silos and departments not always talking to each other. What would be your key recommendation to us to address that silo issue?
I think I'd just refer to the work that I know your Chief Executive is already doing. He has changed the structure to attempt to break down that silo pattern of behaviour, and I think that's the first step of this journey to change the culture.
Thank you. I was going to ask the silo question as well. In terms of Collin Park, and you were saying that you thought that the 3 different consultations was a bit of an overkill. We're now a bit of an impasse because we've still got quite 2 distinctive different groups giving us views. So how would you suggest we move forward to deliver what the majority of the community want, but without having more consultation?
Through you, Your Worship. Look, that issue will be addressed in the next report. So operationally, how we address each of these particular projects is the subject of the next report.
Next question, if I may, to Max. So the interviewing that you did with different staff, we've got a completely different, a new CE who's got a completely different way of operating and a different way of managing his staff and filtering down through that. Through the talking with staff, was there any indication that they could see that there's already been a change and that they felt that we're heading in a better direction now under a different leadership style?
It wasn't a matter that was directly canvassed in questioning, but I would say all the comment I got was positive in that regard.
Under the new operating style. Thank you.
Move the recommendations as they are written, but I'd like to add an E that the Chief Executive, I'd like to,
Jeremy will just have a response, and then I'll go back to Councillor Robson. Sorry for omitting that.
So, thank you, Mr. Mayor. This just talks to DC 88, so we were just asked to pull together a brief covering report to get this onto the agenda, picking up the 5 recommendations made by Max, including the last one around the guidance about what comes to committees. We've picked those up. We've given a initial feedback on that. The case-by-case stuff on the specific projects, the intention is to bring those reports back through project services and operations. Sorry? Is it not working? I can yell if you want. So the intention is to bring back the reports on the specific projects through Project Services and Operations Committee. And that's just a little bit of flag there in section 12 of this report. And if you've got questions on the specifics, I may be able to answer them, but there's much more expert knowledge around over there and around over there.
The fact that it's coming back to projects and services is part of that. I think that's the answer we were looking for there. Was that Councillor Brown? Yeah.
Be probably through to Martin, I think, but just because I did put Max on the spot with the consultant's report on the Greaton traffic situation. Martin, are you able to specifically clarify whether their recommendation that traffic would get worse was based on the pedestrian crossing traffic light or on the design of the project?
Going through the chair, going back through the information on the modelling, certain elements of the project, it would seem that flows would improve, but other elements of it, flows would worsen. But overall, the overall project, there would be a slight worsening of efficiency through that. It wasn't anything specific around, I'm not aware of anyway, specific around the pedestrian crossing as such, but it was looking at the overall performance of the project in that section of the network. Yep.
Can we get a copy of the Invivo report, because we've never seen it?
Me, and thanks, Max. And now, sorry, Councillor Robson, you have our undivided attention now.
I'd like to move is the 4 recommendations with the addition of an E, and that E reads that the CE reports back at the next PSNO on all current projects using the lens of report DC 88.
Can Councillor Robson be specific about the projects? Are you talking about every single project that council is doing, or these specific ones here? Thank you.
No, I'm talking about all projects, and I have some specific projects in mind that if I speak to the motion, if I get a seconder, that I will, use as examples and evidence, if you like. But I think it was made clear by Max that this was a cross-section, a sample, and so reporting back just on 4 doesn't make sense.
Ask a question before now there's a seconder. I didn't realise that Councillor Robson hated our Chief Executive so badly, but seriously, how much work is that going to require? Because I don't want to support something that's just too much, too soon. We understood, you said culture change takes time. We've got the message. Can you just tell us if that's going to be much more workload for the organisation at this point?
Well, by the 14th of May, we might be able to identify every project we're currently doing, because literally there will be hundreds. Then the second issue is about to what level you want these reported on and what aspects do you want reported on. So it's not as simple as simply coming back and reporting on every project we're currently undertaking, and picking up on the advice and guidance of the report writer. He did indicate that even projects of several $1 million should be quite routine for staff to get on and deliver, and only report back, I would have thought, to council on by exclusion, I would have thought. So it's probably worth some further discussion.
Okay, I'll just get Councillor Robson to clarify that, because he did mention that he was in the discussion going to mention specific ones. So if can I just get that clarified, and then I'll go to Councillor Brown as well.
The lens of DC 88, I thought Max made reasonably clear, was, you know, projects above a certain size and scale, or projects that obviously had a degree of political sensitivity. Now, we have an experienced chief executive. He's not new. I would expect him to use his judgment, but it's all projects that qualify under the lens of DC 88. Now, there's obviously many things qualify under that lens that are neither significant financially nor of the other projects that more than one member will be aware of that have not yet received the scrutiny of these four, and I believe they need it.
Yeah, through you, Your Worship. Look, we're quite happy to develop a framework through which we identify priority, high risk, or sensitive focused projects, and report those back on a regular basis through the Project Services and Operations Committee.
That's the intent of E.
Would that wording need tweaking at all? Where is it here? To ensure that, yep. We'll just bring it up. We'll get the wording right.
Shall we?
And in the meantime, do you want to adjourn to get the wording right?
Does that make sense?
Yes, it will. So we'll just a few minutes. Don't leave the room because it won't be long. Okay, so just in conjunction with the mover, we've got the wording in particular of E worked out, and so I'll now ask Councillor Robson to speak to that. Councillor Robson, thank you.
Yeah, look, this I think is an extraordinarily valuable report, and it's given me pause to reflect. On the 29th of July 2016, I published in local media some questions in relation to the objectivity of the quality of information received by councillors. On the 12th of August 2016, I made some public comment on the responsiveness or lack of it of the then CE. On the 9th of September 2016, I challenged and gave an example of a failure to provide quality financial information to councillors by staff. So, after 3 years, 2 code of conduct complaints which both failed, 1 change of mayor, 1 change of chief executive, and 1 by-election, I think today, with report DC 88, we're seeing evidence of the change that I've so much wished for in Tauranga City Council. I think the work done by Max gives examples of effectively symptoms of a malaise that's a product of the fish rotting from the head. I think the responsibility for the culture of the organisation rests with the councillors. I make reference to the changes that needed to happen at the top of the organisation for this to take place. But I do believe, and I do believe our community can take heart from the fact that with this mayor and this chief executive going forward, we are now heading in the right direction. A direction that we strayed from for a significant period of time. I'm not going to speak for longer than really is necessary to make the point, only to say that there are current projects for which there is significant concern in our community. Roading projects, infrastructure projects. I myself have expressed concerns about the quality of information we as councillors have put out to our community. You know, we heard today of an example of information not being provided with regard to the Greaton roading project to our community. But I believe strongly that we failed to provide information to our community during the long-term plan consultation process. We have not been as transparent as we should have on occasions. I know that in the last year or so, decisions have been made that I believe councillors should have been prepared to allow their vote to be seen in public, and they've chosen not to. I spoke earlier today about the need for transparency and light in democracy, about openness. We need to move to a culture of openness, as our chief executive so eloquently put, working with our community, not doing things to them or for them. And you can only work with them in partnership if you share. The projects that spring to mind that I would like us to cast the lens of DC 88 across, off the top of my head, without even having to study it, are the Strand to Memorial Park walkway. Right? Another one is the roundabout up in Otamotai Road. Another one, to be honest, and this fits within our gift, fellow councillors, is the quality and balance and transparency of the information we put in the annual report, which effectively signs off this triennium. I urge you to select, to vote for the recommendations, including recommendation E, which broadens this from a discussion of 4 projects to perhaps a wider discussion and may give us pause to reflect on our role in the failings that we see. As I say, I think they are symptoms of a malaise at the top, one that I believe that the Mayor and Chief Executive are a significant part of a change away from, taking us to a better place. Thank you.
Yep, I agree with much of what Councillor Robson says, and I believe that the culture does come from the top down, but as our Chief Executive says, it also takes time. I do think that what we've signing off today is really the easy part. It's easy to point a few fingers and have some lists, and they'll be well thought out and well analysed through a very experienced person, and it's a great start. However, the culture that is going to go through the organisation does come from the governance as well, and I think that it behoves us to change our behaviour and around those things about accountability, about performance, about analysis, and we live in an incredibly complex environment. It is way more difficult governing an organisation and a community with the scale and the speed and the complexity of the issues that we have to face than, say, a small rural council that doesn't have a lot of change. So we need to up our game. We need to become much better governors, in my opinion, and that's the way that the culture is going to go. And it's if it's going to change, and it's backing our chief executive, and specifically it's around having an open framework, analysing the data really well, and being prepared to make strong decisions. And engagement is an important part of that. And I think that the project and service and operations and services committee and that particular last amendment will certainly be assisted by the stakeholder engagement review that's occurring. So I do vote for the amendment. It's a good one, and but it's only a start. The proof of the pudding is in the eating down the line. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll be supporting all of the recommendations. I think our previous leadership, there was definitely a style of get stuff done, and I don't think he used the word stuff. And he said whatever gets resourced gets done, and I don't think there was enough of a community lens there. And the encouragement from the chief executive of the day was to get stuff done no matter what. And this report clearly speaks to the need for change in the culture, the way we all operate, that's staff and elected members, and probably the community, to be fair. And whilst there's some commentary at the moment, all 11 must go, equally and more important is actually the culture change within the organisation, driven by the CEO and the 6 general managers, who are all capable of change management and creating a culture of putting the community first, but utilising the councillors and our roles, particularly the ward councillors, of being that lens with the community as well. We know what our community will tolerate and what they won't on most occasions. I think we need to reflect that staff are definitely the enduring council. We come and sadly we go in 180 days, some of us may not be here, but staff are here every day delivering not just the big projects, but the everyday repairs and maintenance, improvements and changes that elected members aren't involved in, and this new recommendation will hopefully speak to that. And this change isn't relevant because of the election. In 6 months, I think we need to, as Councillor Robson said, steer this in the right direction, steer the Waka in the right direction, but we all must pick up our game and put the community first, keep the community lens or DC 88 on at all times. And it's not just the big stuff. It's like it affects the community if we chop down a tree or we don't. We reseal a road or we don't. We put up a new sign or we don't. Those are the things that really must affect our community, and we have to think about how it might affect those communities. We've got 47 activities, we've got hundreds of plans, there's 17 transportation projects alone, but those are the ones that affect the community the most, and those are the ones we need to keep closest to our hearts.
Thank you, Mayor Greg. DC 88 is long overdue, and I'd like to thank our new Chief Executive for initiating this review. It's highlighted many things, the culture change that's required, which is led from the top down, the focus on the community rather than the tasks. I remember some 5 years ago, millions of rate dollar money going into a project called Into the Blue. It's supposed to be a culture change program. It was a total flop, but those millions of dollars were spent without any outcome that I could see. So it's long overdue. To me, today shows the beginning of a new culture, and it's by discussing this paper in an open, transparent manner in a public meeting is, to me, it's a good start. So thank you very much, Marty, for leading this journey. And the newly introduced Projects, Services and Operations Committee, and the fact that all elected members will be on all committees, I believe this will greatly reduce potential for projects to derail and to better do the right thing for the community. So, thank you. Look forward to the journey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't look very kindly upon councillors and indeed former councillors who hang council employees out to dry. Now, I'm not suggesting that has occurred here in any way, but I'm just saying in the past there have been situations where, and really in my view a very cheap political move, where some of our nation's least effective politicians, what they do is they blame council staff for their lack of leadership. They blame the paid staff who can't fight back for the collective council's failure in leadership. And it's done up and down the country, and you get certain, comments out there like, whether it be Auckland Council or wherever, no, the staff run the show. And that is a concept which is given life and given oxygen by those making an excuse for their own lack of leadership. That being said, there are times when there is a failure of the organisation, and whilst the ones who are accountable to the community are at the end of the day most accountable, there are times when change needs to be made in the organisation, and the way in which that is done is a matter of quite a bit of delicacy, because the elected council under the Local Government Act only employs one person, that being he or she, the chief executive of the day. And so that is the only person who we can hold account, and is the only person whom we must hold account on behalf of our community. So in doing that, publicly castigating a staff member or a chief executive, and putting that in the media and that sort of thing is not particularly helpful, because what it would do is result in a personal grievance, which is paid for by, remind me, who pays the wages around here? Oh, it's the ratepayers, yeah. And so, if someone were to go out there and try and be a hero and blame somebody for their own lack of leadership, personal grievance, ratepayers pay. So it is better on balance for councillors to take more responsibility. But I would say that last year we deliberately employed a new chief executive. That was a significant decision. And when I say new chief executive, I mean experienced chief executive. And that was one of the best decisions that we have made in my 5 years in this organisation. And I have great confidence that we are seeing now the fruits of that change through the accountability that we are seeing in public here today.
Yeah,
thank you. I certainly support this recommendation, especially Ian. I must thank Councillor Robson for bringing that forward, and what better time than right now. First of all, I'd like to congratulate our CEO, Marty, for a start, for at least bringing in an independent person to review the 4 projects that I feel in process were a failure by TCC. And to do that, as mentioned by Max before, it's not easy to do, and some councils don't. So I admire for what you have done. As regards to the projects, there's many. Takes time, as Councillor Mason said. There is some projects in my mind too, and one good example is 15th Ave. Absolutely, we should look at that again. So finally, I've got to say that yes, I am relying on our relatively new CEO to certainly make these things happen.
Yeah, I agree with the comments about the value of this report. Thank the Chief Executive for it, and Max for his work in doing it. Culture takes time to form and takes time to change, and I am concerned about there that we will potentially spend too much time reviewing and not getting on with what is really, really important work this council needs to do for the remainder of this year to focus on our transport and our urban form issues. But I won't stand on that and vote against it if everyone's keen to see some kind of review, so long as we allow the Chief Executive to balance that out. Returning in 2016 to this council, I was certainly aware, and I think Councillor Malloy might agree with me, as we were the 2 that came back after the yellow card for 3 years, that there was a change had occurred, very significant one in our opinion, and I agree that with Councillor Robson that the responsibility of the culture rests with the councillors, and the change I had seen occurring in that 3 years must rest with the councillors of that triennium, and the failure to make any changes here has to rest with us sitting around this table. I would love to see a review of the Heart of the City process, because that was something that I took on as chair of the City Transformation Committee and found it to be a train in motion going virtually nowhere, since those who voted to start it in the end voted to kill it, and we are left sitting where we are today with so little done for so much spent. But it would be a waste of money to go and review it, because there are enough lessons in the 4 things we've looked into here for us to go forward with the Chief Executive committing to a culture change. I would like to make a comment about 2 of the projects, one of them being the Te Papa Unamanu Poru Takataka, as there are some references there as to the fact that the staff did not come to us and try and increase the budget and so on. This is where I believe we have a responsibility in setting the culture in this organisation, and given that on 3 occasions in this triennium we have, with very little rationale, by very slim majorities, slashed recommendations in budgets from 5 million to 2.5 million in terms of the visitor information centre being requested by Tourism Bay of Plenty. The Aspen Reserve, oh my gosh, $1 million is too much, let's just cut it in half, and so it's not been completed. And the Harrington Street car park, which we thought we would just add a couple of floors to, with very little intelligent thought, in my opinion. That creates a culture, and I believe that creates a culture amongst our staff where they are reluctant and very concerned that much of their hard work and effort going into projects that have been initiated by us are sometimes potentially going to be at risk. And I believe we should not be doing this. It is not rational in any way, shape or form for governors of an organisation this size to be making such knee-jerk reactions in the middle of lengthy processes. We need to be careful with what we initiate and then be prepared with amendments going through as we listen to the community and so on to get those things finished. With the Greaton example, I just make one comment, as I said before, someone who goes through there a lot. The fact that a consultant might have pointed out that a traffic light pedestrian crossing would have added some congestion is not something I don't think we should have paid for. It's pretty common sense. That intersection with before the traffic light on the pedestrian crossing was a problem, but as soon as you put a traffic light there, you're stopping traffic for longer than you are when you allow people to sprint across. It's a safety issue, of course, and that's what we're focused on, a safety issue. But we are again, I think, spending a lot of money to try and fix something that was not fixable, except with the bigger roading projects we need, which is at Barks Corner at one end, and the connection from 15th Avenue to Takitumu Drive, which we are desperate NZTA to commence, so that we can divert traffic off Cameron Road, and that would make a significant impact upon the traffic congestion through Greaton. So I hope we don't, by this report, give fuel to some out there who are saying we should go back to what we had before. We have had enormous growth out there in the south, and that inevitably comes down Cameron Road and goes through Greaton. But with those comments, I shall conclude my remarks.
Yeah, I just want to commend the Chief Executive for instigating this review, and certainly the very clear messages have come through in terms of the way that we develop our projects going into the future. I'm particularly concerned about the Memorial Park to the Strand walkway, particularly in that we don't have any real firm understanding of the costings, and we should really be having that estimated to us first before we even go and do all this consultation. There's a big difference between a $5 million price tag and a $10 or $15 million one, so that would be a lesson that I would hope would be learnt from this. Councillor Brown made reference to the social media hashtag 11 must go. I think we need to have a new one, hashtag 11 must lead, and that's our responsibility.
Think of the field marshal again and that walk, but however, other speakers. Okay, right of reply, Councillor. Councillor Malloy. Yep.
Yeah, just want to support the comments made about our CE and Max for that report. I think it's great. You know, I've always said in chambers, but also in our lounge there, that, you know, if a relationship isn't working, the first person you need to look at is yourself, and that's very often where the problem lays, or lies. And secondly, you know, we are governors of the city. We are, and if things aren't going right, we have to take responsibility for it. And I fully accept that. And we have to work with our CE, who will guide us really and take us all the way through. But we have to work closely with our CE to make sure things are right. But at the end of the day, the community will tell us exactly what they think of us, and we'll find out. Thank you.
Yeah, just quickly. There's been a lot of comment made around the Chief Executive, and I'm embarrassed for him. But as I again said earlier today, let's not anyone rewrite history. To get a new Chief Executive, there had to be a decision made not to extend the contract of the previous Chief Executive. And my understanding, I wasn't here, is that that was not a unanimous decision. Some people were happy to retain the services of the previous Chief Executive. I wouldn't like to see any history being rewritten in this chamber or in any other forum, public or private. I think in that reference, we just heard one comment, we don't want to spend too much time reviewing. And sadly, that echoes the words of the previous Chief Executive, who exhorted a relatively new council, a mixture of people, not a group hand-picked for their skills, but a group of people who volunteered in good faith and got the support of the community and were elected. They were exhorted not to spend too much time reviewing, to look forward. As a matter of fact, we sort of lost, to a certain extent, the monitoring role, which Max Peterson alluded to, and I'm so pleased to see the councillor with the best attention to detail currently chairing the PSO meeting. So pleased to see that group back. We have an obligation for what we're doing, not just what we think we might want to do. Right? We can do two things at once on a good day. Walk and chew gum, yeah? Plan for tomorrow while successfully providing for today, to quote someone, right? Quite often people, you know, even a broken clock can be right twice a day, I remind people. So, look, we all know where we are. The lessons hopefully have been learned. I fear that in the upcoming election campaign, much will be forgotten about the need for getting the numbers in front of people, about the dreams and aspirations, that the promises made will not be costed, that assertions will be made without evidence, and we will very quickly forget the homage we paid to the Chief Executive and Max Peterson here today. I hope that's not the case. And one last point, Chief Executive doesn't operate alone. The relationship between the Mayor and Chief Executive, the conduit for us to the Chief Executive, is critical. And I notice I'm the only one that's commented on it, so I'll take the effort to repeat it. The change started with a change of Mayor. And from then, luck continued to run with us. We may not be so lucky next time. Thank you.
So thanks, Councillor Robson. We'll put that motion A to E. All in favour say aye. Aye. Against, and that's carried. So just in closing the meeting, thanks everybody for all the comments, and just mentioning that Marty has mentioned to me that, of course, a crucial part of his support network is the executive team, and of course that's being put in place as we speak, so that is, you know, really important to the way forward for the council too. So declare the meeting closed, and thank you all for your attendance.